When someone says multiculturalism, what exactly do they mean, right? If someone is saying multiculturalism is great or multiculturalism is awful and it's a failure, perhaps the first question is, okay, what do you mean by multiculturalism? The perspective is just limited, right? We only know what we know. And oftentimes people think that they know a lot more than they do. I'm not a huge fan of feminism, certainly not in its modern incarnation. Whether people are talking about the globalist elites or they or the deep state, right? Whoever people believe is the big threat to humanity or to the West or to their nation or to their society. Whoever that is, one of the biggest tools in an opponent's arsenal is demoralization. But I spent a lot of time in the UK. I'm British myself. I spent a lot of time in the US, and I do find, generally speaking, in the USA, people are much more open and collaborative and see people less as competition. I think I said on a podcast maybe about 2 to 3 years ago that I believe we've passed peak woke. I like that you use the word debased, because for something to be debased, that suggests that it has a foundation.
Zuby, welcome back to the show, and this time we get to do it in person here in Dubai.
It's a pleasure, man. Good to see you again.
And I was saying to you before we hit record, it's been 2 years since we spoke. A number of things have changed. First of all, we're in Dubai, and you've moved here.
I have, yeah. I've been a nomad for the past 2.5 years, and I have just rented an apartment in Dubai. I've actually been a resident here since, I think May or June 2023. And that's also when I started my business here. It was incorporated April 2023, and I've been here multiple times, but due to the nature of who I am and what I do, I'm always traveling. I went to 14 different countries last year, some of them multiple times. I think I went to the US 5 times, UK 6 times, South Africa twice, and then a whole bunch of other places as well. So it's been an adventure. The adventure will continue, but I have found the place where I see my future. I found the place where I want to raise my future family and where I want to headquarter my business and my operations. So I'm still going to be spending plenty of time in the USA. I'm still going to go back to the UK. I'm still going to be generally traveling the world, whether that's to do podcasts, speaking events, live performances, or anything else. So I'll still be traveling, but I'll at least have a place I can call home.
I'm interested to know what the driving factors were with Dubai, because a lot of people immediately jump to the financial.
Sure.
But I've seen you share a tweet talking about the importance of how Dubai has a rule of law which has allowed successful multiculturalism. And that's a phrase at the moment that a lot of people are pushing back on in terms of, multiculturalism has failed in the UK, and phrases like that are flying around a lot at the moment. But Dubai flies in the face of that to some extent. Yeah,
I think oftentimes people misdiagnose problems because they don't have a broad enough perspective on the world. And I don't say this to be arrogant or condescending in any way, but if you just think about most people around the entire world, it doesn't matter whether they're in the West, in the East, in Africa, in any part of the world, most people do not travel that much. I would be surprised if most people, I think probably it's a minority of people around the globe who have ever left their own country. I would be surprised if it's over 50% of people who, in the course of their life, have ever left. I mean, a lot of people can't really even afford to.
There's an affluence factor there, yeah.
There's an affluence factor. There is also, for people who are in more developed countries, there's also a curiosity factor. So most Americans, for example, biggest country in the West by a mile, most Americans don't even have a passport. Most British people have left the UK, as far as I know. Most Americans have never left the USA and never will. Now, some people will say, we don't need to because the country is so large and there's so much diversity there. And it's true. It's a massive country and you've got multiple time zones, climates, types of scenery, types of people, and so on. But it's still a single country. And if you never leave your country, it doesn't matter whether you're born and raised in America or Saudi Arabia or Ghana or Japan, if you have never stepped foot outside of it, you will always have a limited perspective on what things are. And so one thing that can happen with that is people misdiagnose issues. So when people say things like, and this is it's no surprise to people, like I'm, by Western standards for sure, I'm generally more conservative leaning on many issues. But even amongst people more right-leaning and conservatives, particularly in the West, in the UK, in the US and Canada, you'll often hear this phrase, multiculturalism doesn't work, multiculturalism is a failure, societies need to be, whether it's ethnically or racially, more homogenous in order for things to function and so on. And to me, it's a massive misdiagnosis of the problem. And I can see why people believe that, because if you just have very quick mass immigration coming in from lots of different countries, and you're not caring about who you're bringing in, and you're not assimilating people, and you're not having people learn the language, and you don't even know what the sort of core values and culture of the nation they're coming into are, and you're not encouraging them to get on board with that, and it's all just happening very quickly, and you're not following. You don't have a clear set of rules, laws, and principles which are being applied to everybody, then the chaos that results from that, it's easy to think, oh, the problem is the diversity.
It's off-putting, isn't it? It gives somebody a negative perception of what multiculturalism might look like.
Yeah, because for multiculturalism to work, other things have to be in place. I mean, people might want to start even by defining terms, right? When someone says multiculturalism, what exactly do they mean, right? If someone is saying multiculturalism is great or multiculturalism is awful and it's a failure, perhaps the first question is, okay, what do you mean by multiculturalism? Do you mean people of different races, ethnicities, nationalities, religions, values, a combination of all? What exactly do you mean? I think if someone means that it doesn't work to have sort of a vacuum of no type of dominant culture or set of values, and then you just bring in people who speak totally different languages from different parts of the world, and they have no obvious commonality and whatever. And then on top of that, you don't have a solid rule book. You don't have a solid set of laws that are being enforced. Obviously, that's not going to work. It doesn't work on any scale. If you were to have, if you were to run an event, or you were to throw a house party, and you just invited completely random people, you just selected people from around the globe at random, 1,000 of them to come to a house party, it might not really work because people don't, it's like, wait, what's everyone here even got in common? This is just messy. And then on top of it, you say you don't have any sort of security or enforcement. So it's gonna be a mess.
I think that's a good analogy though, because that's what we are experiencing potentially in the UK at the moment, and that's why phrases like that are popular amongst a base where typically you would have some shared views. Yeah. But on multiculturalism, where you have spoken about the almost positive implementation of that in Dubai, I think that's a really interesting distinction between the two.
Yeah, it is. I think it's true on any scale, whether you're talking about a nation or you're talking about, my example of like a house party or even a friendship group. Think of your friends and think of who you're acquainted with. Like, I don't know exactly who your friendship circle and acquaintance circle is. I would assume it's pretty diverse. If I look at mine, if you were to come to one of my meetups or come to a live performance of mine or event that I'm speaking at or whatever, it doesn't matter whether I'm doing it in Texas or in Dubai or in London or in Sydney, Australia, it's going to be a diverse crowd in terms of people's backgrounds, in terms of people's religions, in terms of male, female, in terms of even politically, it's not going to be like all conservatives or all libertarians or all it's going to be a mix of people, but there's a commonality and a culture amongst those people that's not visible, which makes the whole thing work. And everyone gets on very well, and there's no conflict. You don't even need to have security. Like, it's all cool.
That's one of the most important things, that we share a set of values and principles.
In theory, I could also throw an event where I invite a lot of people who quote unquote look like me, and it could be a complete disaster if they don't share my values and beliefs and they're not of a certain character and set of behaviors and so on. And so I think with many of these issues, they get misdiagnosed. This happens in multiple things. We've touched on the multiculturalism one. Something that is connected to it, for example, is even some of the conversations people have about race and racism and things like that, particularly in the USA. A lot of what they call racism, if you actually boil it down, it's actually classism. Or some of it is just... again, they read things across the wrong lines. So there might be some issue and they're like, oh, the problem here is it's a racial problem. Like, they view it through that lens, whereas actually you're like, wait, this is like a poverty or a deprivation problem.
That's a great point. We both interviewed Rob Henderson, who's just released Troubled, and Rob was speaking about the dynamics in the US, and he's an extremely clued up guy, and he was saying the number of white people who are categorized as white trash, and that's like a really offensive slurring term. But ultimately, their problem is not their race. Their problem is their class and their access. Yeah. And people would look in the same way at like a ghetto, which was predominantly black people, and the behaviors that went on in there, and shun that. Again, the problem is not necessarily the color of their creed. It's the access they have to resources, the access they have to education, the standards and values that
it's culture. Are there fathers in the community? Look, it doesn't matter okay, let's take the race or ethnicity factor out the equation. If you show me any community in the world, it could be in Glasgow, it could be in wherever, where you have a very low rate of people growing up with fathers in the home or their parents ever having been married, and there's no culture of, let's say you have a place where most people there aren't a lot of fathers in the home or in the community. The education levels are poor. You've got tons of single mothers, and the general sort of culture, the kind of place where it's cooler to go to prison than to go to university. The outcomes are going to be quite predictable. It doesn't matter if the community is predominantly white or Latino or Indian, or although an Indian community like that might be hard to find to their credit, or black or whatever it is. The outcomes in terms of incarceration rates and criminality rates and economic achievement or lack thereof, all these type of things, it's predictable. Whereas if you find another community, again, regardless of the race, ethnicity, or whatever, where, okay, the vast majority of households are two-parent families, married, growing up in a certain environment with certain values and so on, you can predict, okay, they're going to have low crime rates, they're going to have high achievement rates, they're going to do well, you're not going to have a lot of people going to prison and this and this. It's very obvious. So I just think that when I look at a lot of these problems and I hear the way people talk, because I'm tuned into I'm not like plugged in totally to the political world or the social commentary world or whatever, but I'm an observer and I'm a thinker. And I know a lot of people who are in these spaces around the world. And I just often think there's a lot of lazy and low resolution analysis that can go on. And I don't even think sometimes it's because people are bad actors or they're trying to spin a certain narrative. But oftentimes I just think it's because the perspective is just limited, right? We only know what we know. And oftentimes people think that they know a lot more than they do. I think if you're going to be in this space, it helps to obviously do your learning and do your research and go out and talk to people and experience the world. But I think the greatest thinkers are very aware of their own ignorance as well. So the way I speak, I'm generally a confident speaker, and people are like, oh, wow, this guy's on the ball. He knows what he's saying.
You're high in assertiveness as well.
Thank you. And I think sometimes people can also misdiagnose that and think that means I think I know everything, or I think that, anyone who knows, I've had so many people who actually know me who are like, man, Zuby is such a humble person. But then there's people who don't know me or have never met me, and they're like, oh, he's like arrogant and he's cocky and he's this and that. And it's because they see or hear confidence and competence and assertiveness, and they conflate that with pridefulness or with arrogance. Like, no, I speak in an assured manner, but I will be the first person to tell you, hey, I don't have it all figured out. I don't know everything. There's way more that I don't know than what I do. And whether I'm sitting on a podcast or I'm standing on a stage or I'm posting on social media, I'm thinking out loud. A lot of the things I say, this isn't like, oh, okay, this is what I've completely worked out and it's unassailable and it's perfect and there's no questions or challenging around it. I'm just thinking out real loud. I'm articulating ideas that you ask me a question and I
this
think
was one
about
of the
it.
concepts we explored last time, and you spoke about how you use these things as a sounding board for testing ideas.
sure.
And that's a really healthy thing to do. But in today's society, some people are afraid to do that for fear of cancellation or criticism. But you've done that for such a long period, particularly on X, and you've built up a reputation for somebody that is a thoughtful thinker on there, and you don't have one lens or one razor that you use to cut through all problems, because you see that across the board, don't you? Like the crypto bros all assume that this is the answer to this.
Bitcoin solves everything.
Exactly, and that's cool. Like, and I think you and I are both Bitcoin holders in that respect. But that shouldn't be the answer to every single problem we come up against. And you, as a serious thinker, are not somebody that if I know one of your views, I can extrapolate that out and explain all of them, because that would paint you to be somebody that is in a box.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. That's actually a very kind compliment. I don't know if it was even intended that way, but that's actually a massive compliment.
Well, I would say so. So if somebody brought up a particular issue, they might guess where you lie,
Yes.
but they wouldn't be certain, and that's actually a good thing, because if they were certain, that's more of a challenge, I think.
Yes, I also that's correct. I also think that to add more to that point is when people have this point to the same supposed problem as being the root of every single other problem, I think that's a sign of cognitive laziness and ideological capture, right? So if no matter what issue you present to me, I tell you that it's the exact same reason, right? People have their personal bugbears. It could be a group of people. It could be an ideology. It could be whatever, right? I'm not a huge fan of feminism, certainly not in its modern incarnation. But it's not like every single issue you throw out there or every problem we discuss, I'm like, oh, that's because of feminism. Oh, that's because of feminism. That's because, right? Whether it's the exact same diagnosis or the exact same solution. There are certain things which do cover quite a lot of ground, but the world is complicated and things are multivariate. There are very few real societal issues where you can just say it's this one thing. There can be a one thing which plays a role in a huge number of them. So if I were to look at the USA in particular, but across the West in particular, and even other parts of the world, and you're to look at some of the downstream social problems, there are certain things you can highlight as, okay, this one thing causes a lot of the problems. So coming back to you were talking about like the crypto bros or, some of the Bitcoin maximalists and things, many of whom I know and love. A lot of people will point to going, fiat currency, going off the gold standard, so that now whether it's dollars or it's pounds or it's euros or whatever, you can just print infinitely.
It's funny money.
You can inflate the currency away, and this causes a lot of downstream problems. That's absolutely true. Another thing that is a big issue and something that I personally do talk a lot about, I've touched on it here, is father absenteeism.
Break down the family unit.
Yes, break down a family unit. For someone like myself, I also believe that the breakdown of people's faith, breakdown of Christianity in the West, breakdown of belief in God, this has a lot of downstream ramifications. But it's not the only thing. I won't just go on every single podcast and just say the solution to absolutely everything is we just need to bring everyone back to Jesus. Ideologically, religiously, I might have a push to want to say that. But it's like things are more complicated.
It's not your only answer to every problem.
It's not the only answer to everything. And I recognize that the world is complicated and people are complicated. And that's a nice way to win brownie points amongst my fellow Christians. Just go on every podcast and just say that everyone just needs to come back to Jesus. But then you also have the, well, how? Like how? It's easy to say, but how do you fix that? Even if you're saying we need to fix the family. It's like, I agree with you. You're never going to get pushback from me of someone saying, we need more nuclear families, we need more fathers in the home. Like, I'm never going to push back against that. But the follow-up is, okay, how? Like, how do we do that? We don't just hit a button. You don't just vote in some politician and they're just make a policy which brings all the fathers magically back into the home and fixes all divorces and all these people's personal problems. It's like, that should be a target and something we talk about more. But then we need to also think seriously about incentives, and we are going to have conversations about the economy and about gender dynamics.
Because it links. It all links.
It all links.
It's multifaceted. And I think that's one of these things that's really important, because you have podcasts that, for lack of a better word, shit on the current situation of the West in particular. And it's easy to poke fun. But if you zoom out, on a whole, society is in a relatively positive place, but we have a lot of problems that have been created from almost laziness and abundance in the environments that we're in. And it's easy to be really negative, but there are lots of opportunities to be positive, and we can still change the trajectory of things, in my personal opinion, because I think if I wasn't felt like that, I would really struggle to get out of bed in the morning and kick on.
It's so important that people believe that. Because if you don't think you can win, you've already lost. And I do think that one of the greatest tools of the enemy, when I say the enemy, I do mean Satan himself, but I do also mean whoever, whether people are talking about the globalist elites or they or the deep state, right? Whoever people believe is the big threat to humanity or to the West or to their nation or to their society, whoever that is, one of the biggest tools in an opponent's arsenal is demoralization. So if you allow yourself, if you allow the people around you, your friends, your community, to become demoralized and to believe that there is no way back and that the future is inevitably going to be worse than the present, then it does become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think you're going to lose, you
We
absolutely
become
will.
apathetic, we become weak, we become docile, and if you use the term they, that's what they would want because you can't push back.
Yeah, they don't need to do anything then, right? Like you've defeated yourself.
Yeah, and we're both huge proponents of personal responsibility, and I think that's one of the first tools in the arsenal to push back against a society that's maybe going in a direction we don't want. Control what you do and what the people around you do.
Yeah.
And try and master your own areas, so your health and your fitness, your relationships, your dynamics, your faith for somebody like yourself to be as well.
It's the best that you can do. It's the best that you can do is to do that, and then by doing it in itself, it will be a light to other people because we don't exist in a vacuum. We are all influenced and inspired by other people, whether that's positively or negatively. So just by you doing what you do, for example, I know you're massively into fitness. You've been training for well over 15 years. You going to the gym and doing this podcast or posting on Instagram or whatever it is you do, you go to the gym for yourself and for your own health and for your own fitness in your body, but it has an impact on others. I don't know how this is quantified. But by you taking care of your health and leading with that and promoting it and talking about it in podcasts, posting videos, whatever the case may be, there will be other people out there who see that and it nudges them. It nudges them a little bit in a direction. I'm sure you've probably got personal friends who've seen you get in shape and maintain your fitness, and they've been like, they see it day after day after day, and they're like, man, maybe I should fix up my nutrition a bit, or I should train a little bit. Like it influences people.
One of my favorite phrases over the last coming up for 4 years now doing the podcast is a rising tide raises all ships.
Yes.
And let's be that tide because it could be in a microcosm where it's for 3 or 4 of your friends or your family members, or it could be somebody like yourself as an audience like yours, or the audience that I'm starting to build as well.
It's a lot of people, man.
And it has a positive ripple effect if we carry on the water analogy.
Yes.
And that is a really good thing. So by owning your own space, creating mastery, living in line with your values, it has a effect of like permeating into those around you. And that is one of the only things that's within our locus of control.
Yeah, everything we do ripples outwards. So, I mean, I'm not the first person to talk about this, but if you do, Jordan Peterson's big on this message, right? You sort your own self out, and then, you can't pour water from an empty jug. That's something I like to say. So if you are in a bad state mentally, physically, spiritually, relationally, financially, whatever, if your life is a mess, number one, that's not inspiring to anybody. But also, you are not in a position to help others because you haven't even, right? If you have no money, let's use money because it's in you. If you have no money, you cannot donate money. Okay, so even if you just wanted to be a charitable person, if you have free time, you can always donate time. But if you actually wanted to help someone financially, this could be a close friend. Maybe you have a sibling or your parent or someone who needs some financial help. If you're in a position where you yourself are totally struggling and you're in debt or whatever, you can't help that other person because you don't have the resources. But if over the course of time, over the years, you've put yourself in a healthy financial situation where you have some type of abundance, then when stuff does hit the fan, or when someone needs help, whether they're close to you or they're outside, you're now in a position where you say, oh, you know what? I have some extra. I can be more charitable now. I can help other people. If we were both totally out of shape and we were just, sitting here all sloppy, whatever, we can't, and someone comes and wants, hey, this person needs advice on nutrition or on training. They're trying to build muscle. They're trying to lose fat, whatever. We don't know what to tell them. We can't help them. We haven't even done it ourselves. Right? But if someone comes to you and is like, hey, I want to get in better shape. How do I do this? You can help them. You can advise them. And I think that the more areas you can do that in, then I don't just think it's not just good for you. It's good for the entire world. We all have so much potential. And if everyone were to just do 10%, 20% more to try to achieve that, the world would be so difficult. And the world would be so different. And what's also powerful with it is it snuffs out so much negativity. Because if you're on your game, I don't know about you, Colin, how much time a week do you spend just hating on other people? Leaving nasty comments, disliking videos, leaving negative reviews for people. How many hours a week do you spend doing that?
None.
Right?
It would just drag down my frequency that I'm operating.
Yeah,
at.
and it's like you're busy. You're doing things. You're on your mission. You're trying to build something. Why would you be spending your time you're trying to build your podcast? You're not going to be going around, let me go leave negative reviews on other people's podcasts. Let me go, like, it's so absurd. But there's people who spend their time doing this. They spend hours per day just trying to tear down other people.
I interestingly think the podcast space is quite positive overall.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
for example, I guest share with 3 or 4 other hosts that I'm on a pretty similar frequency to. Some of the guys have grown their show massively. Some of them are kind of in the slipstream and I'm trying to help them along with me as well. And we're all pushing on together. And from the outside looking in, you might think, oh, but that's like your competitor for listening hours or for somebody's attention. Yeah. And I'm thinking, no, we come from a place of abundance.
Yes.
And if I introduce Zuby to one of my friends, then Zuby will have a great episode with them and my friend will get a great episode for their show. Yes. And that's cool. That's a positive thing because we just spread the positive message. We're putting things out there that are helpful. Yeah. But some people would be like, oh no, like you don't want to encourage that person's podcast to grow because it might take away from yours. And I don't think you can think like that. And I think the podcast space overall, from my experience of it, is more positive.
I absolutely agree with you. And that mentality you touched on is one of my favorite things about the USA. Because in the USA, that mentality is more abundant than I think it is in the UK or generally in other European countries. The idea that there is more than enough to go around. Some of this might be because it's a giant country with hundreds of millions of people and so much space and empty land that it naturally promotes more of a surplus mentality than a scarcity mentality. But I spend a lot of time in the UK. I'm British myself. I spend a lot of time in the US, and I do find, generally speaking, in the USA, people are much more open and collaborative and see people less as competition. And oh, this person's coming up. Let me help lift him up. Let's do this opportunity and whatever. Whereas in the UK, and maybe this is changing a little bit more, particularly in the last 10 years or so, but there's always been a more of a competitive mentality and the idea that only a few people can be successful at once.
Yeah, food on my table takes away from food on
exactly. And
theirs.
I don't want to raise this person up because then they become competition and so on. And I understand why people think that way. I actually think it's quite ingrained in us because there are many things that actually. So my brain's jumping around everywhere because this also links into some people's political mentalities. But there are certain things where it is true that if someone takes more of their quote unquote fair share, then there is less for other people. Okay? If there's 3 of us here and we order a pizza and the pizza comes and there are 8 slices and I take 5, that's kind of messed up. That's like, hey, like you only left. now the other guys, have to don't get as much.
They feel
right?
hard done by.
Yeah, that people feel hard done by. And sadly, some people scale that to everything. So there's people in this world who think that the reason poor people exist is because rich people exist, right? The whole eat the rich thing, down with the 1%, these people, these billionaires shouldn't be allowed to exist, whatever it is. They literally think that because Elon Musk and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, whatever, because they have so much money, that's the reason why there's so many poor people around the world. And if you knew absolutely nothing about economics, maybe if you told me that when I was 5 years old, I would believe that because I would be like, well, yeah, that makes sense. They have so much and these people have so little. So it's just the distribution. But whereas when you understand how the economy works and how like actually the pie grows, and in fact, by having super wealthy people, do you know where you don't want to live? You don't want to live where there's no wealthy people. Right?
Trickle down economics.
Huh?
Trickle down economics.
It's not just trickle down economics, but it's like, how many people does Elon Musk employ? How many people does Bill Gates employ, right? Have you ever used a Windows product? How many people have become wealthier and even started businesses themselves off of the back of the various Amazon services, off of Meta? And people might hate on Meta, but how many millionaires have been created by using Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. How many businesses has Microsoft Office and Microsoft Windows helped to run, right? So you can hate on Mark Zuckerberg, you can hate on Bill Gates, you can hate on whoever you want, but you know, a lot of the people saying this, they'll be saying down when I'll be like, all right, who do you work for? And they'll name, especially if they work for some big company, corporate. I'm like, all right, who's the head of that? Like you work for multimillionaires and billionaires. They pay you. They're paying thousands and thousands of employees. They didn't just sort of snap their fingers and all of a sudden the money. So when you really think about these things, it's why it gets frustrating, because I can understand certain narratives existing among people who are very young or even actual children. But when I meet someone who's like in their 30s or their 40s or their 50s and they still believe that the reason why...
A phrase in the UK is student union politics, isn't it?
Student union politics. I haven't actually heard that phrase, but it makes sense.
Well, when I studied at I did politics at University of all things at University of Glasgow, and I certainly saw that in full effect, where people had been insulated from the real world. They hadn't been in employment. They hadn't been a business owner. So their views on taxation and wealth were, of course, more left-leaning and almost to the point of anti it.
Yes.
And I would always say they're in a bubble because they haven't been exposed to the realities of trying to grow a business and trying to bring on employees and trying to feed families or whatever the kind of the responsibilities you take on are. But as you say, that's understandable in children who haven't had that exposure. And many university, I mean, I went to uni at 17 and I felt like a child, to be honest, that just started drinking and partying for the first year or so. And it makes sense at that point. But thereafter, as you say, it's really worrying that people still have this negative worldview.
Yeah. I mean, there's politicians themselves who make these statements, who will talk about, the reason inflation exists is because of corporate greed, as if companies just randomly decide to just raise their prices rather than the fact that central banks are overprinting money and they're devaluing the currencies and so on. And, I think a lot of these narratives persist because grievance politics is sadly a lucrative and powerful thing to tap into. And it always has been. It's something that I'm very cautious of myself, because you can see how easy it is to manipulate people or get them to do things by tapping into fear, anxiety, hopelessness. We're generally much more sensitive to negative emotions than we are to positive ones. And I guess that's just a human survival tactic.
I pulled one of your tweets, Zuby, in preparation for this, and it links exactly with that, because you were speaking about a problem with a lot of traditions and old ideas is often they're not explained why they're done and why they're important. They're just pushed on with authority. And that makes total sense, because you're speaking there about the marketing and the branding of negative ideas and maybe some of the flashy communist or socialist policies that we're maybe looking at. In contrast, traditional things like the family unit, starting your own business and bringing on employees and growing and feeding families and putting bread on the table, those are older ideas, and they don't have the same marketing campaign and the same energy behind them, and they are almost pushed on with authority and like almost told like, that's what's better for you. And facts really do tell that is the case, but they aren't as, I want to say, sexy or as marketable.
Well, if you appeal to people's baser natures and sinful natures, in a way, it always gives you an unfair advantage to doing the opposite. So at least in this realm, this is where, to me, it even gets kind of deep and spiritual, because even certainly in Abrahamic religions, where we believe in Satan, and we believe that God has dominion over heaven and the earth, but Satan is a very real presence. And Satan wins or gets victories by tapping into people's base, animalistic, sinful natures, because that is always easier and often, at least short-term, more pleasurable than doing the thing that is righteous and correct. So when you have industries or individuals who are promoting lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, quick riches, anger, wrath, vengeance, whatever it may be, gluttony, right? Go through the 7 deadly sins, right? You can use all of those things for easy marketing. You can, and it doesn't even matter what domain you're in. If you appeal to the flesh, right? So lust, right? If you get people, just throw a naked or a half semi-naked woman next to anything. It could be a car, whatever, right? That's it's gonna get attention. It doesn't even matter the arena. It's known that's gonna get attention.
Evolutionary wiring dictates that.
Yes, if you tap into the things that promote victim mentality, you know what? Actually, it's not your fault. Do you know who the problem is? It's insert people who you want to target, right? They're the problem. People like that because it's like, oh, okay, I'm not to blame. It's not me. It's not me that's the problem. It's them, right? And so if you tap into that and you keep on, it's the divide and conquer. And it's just easier. It's easier. If you are trying to build a social media platform, if you're trying to grow on X, you're trying to do whatever, do you know an easy way to grow is you get people jacked, you get people angry. You post stuff that's very divisive. You get people you constantly tap into the outrage marketing. You can do this. You could be on the left. You could be on the right. You could even be non-political, right? You just tap into, you keep hitting those triggers and you will get views.
If you create an outgroup or you create othering of a group, then it is a much easier way to build a tribe, as you say.
It's easy. It's easier to do that, or to just again, just appeal to people's lust, appeal to people's greed, appeal to why do scams even work? Every scam is based on human greed. Every scam doesn't think of it. Every single thing, it's based on greed, right? Like you want to, think of any financial scam. Whether this is like a rug pull crypto or this is a Bernie Madoff type situation or whatever the case is, you appeal to greed. You're like, hey, you can make fast, easy money by here's the trick. Here's the trick. Someone who pauses and is more rational will be like, there's something. This is a little
feels too good to be true.
It seems too good to be true. There's no, but the greed. If you let the greed override, then you can get yourself into really bad situations because it just runs away with you. And then eventually, when the house of cards collapses, you're the one left holding the bag, or you're the one who is left destitute.
How do we encourage more people to take the righteous path?
Man, I do think this is where helps to bring people back to God, man. First,
I have two close friends, both of who have appeared in the podcast, who are born again Christians.
Good.
And some of the discussions I've had with them have made me think a lot about my situation. And I was christened in the Protestant church growing up, but never had a continuous faith. I have a very strong set of family values that I was given through my mother and my father, which I'm very, very thankful for.
Are they religious?
They're not.
No, okay.
They're not. But again, they were Christians as children, but we don't have a faith.
Cultural Christians.
Exactly that, which is quite common in the west of Scotland in particular, between either the Catholic faith or the Protestant faith.
Understood.
And the more conversations I have with them, the more I see society becoming so debased is a huge challenge.
This is interesting. I like that you use the word debased. Because for something to be debased, that suggests that it has a foundation to begin with. Or I've heard people use the term unmoored, which suggests that there was a moor to begin with. So it's like, okay, what is that base? What's the base? What's the foundation? What are those legs on the table that are keeping the table up? I would say those are generally faith, family. I feel like which one am I missing?
Rule of law.
Faith, family, yes. Let's have rule of law. And maybe let's have health, right? You could say that those are maybe four pillars that keep both individuals and communities standing. And, you could knock out one leg of a table and it'll generally still continue to stand. It'll be a bit wobbly. If you knock out two of them, knock out three of them, or you erode all four of them, then all of a sudden, a big conversation that's been happening over the years is about both physical health, but more primarily mental health, right? Everyone's like, well, why is anxiety rising? Why is it depression? Why is there depression? Why are young people feeling so dismayed? And I'm like, man, you've knocked out the pillars of their foundation. You've attacked the family, you've attacked the faith and told people that it's all backwards and nonsense and superstition and it doesn't matter. And then it's like, why do they have no purpose? Why do they have no meaning? It's like, well, what are they even living for? And then you add on top of it social media and technology and a not healthy economy and so on. It's like, man, of course people are going to be feeling hopeless. Of course they're going to be lacking direction and purpose because they're not oriented and geared towards anything. And I think people also need to remember, because I'm sure there's someone who's listening to this right now and who's thinking, oh, well, I'm not I don't have a faith or a religion and I'm doing fine. And people like to make everything about themselves. And the truth is not everything scales as well. And I would argue that if you've kind of made this point for me, which is that even if an individual or even perhaps an individual family is not religious per se, but they have certain things that they still abide by.
I would call it traditional values.
Yes, and they're growing up in an environment, so say Scotland, right? It's still a predominantly, in terms of the base, in terms of the foundation, it's still a Christian country at its core with its history. And there's still lots of, active and practicing Christians who are out there in the mix. That has an effect as well, because you have a lot of these like Western atheists who are growing up in places and in environments which are heavily based on Christianity and Christian ethics, and then they themselves move away from the faith, from the church, and they're like, oh well, I'm okay. And I'm like, dude, you're ignoring the fact that like all these environmental factors around you, right? Like you didn't just get your morals from nowhere, right? You didn't just. There's not a vacuum there. But to your point and to my point, if you move away over the course of time, over the course of generations, over the course of decades, you shift society completely away from all of these things, then you end up with what we're currently dealing with: all-time high anxiety, all-time high depression. Sure, we have all-time high GDP as well, but like despite all of the positive markers in terms of the way people themselves actually feel, in terms of male-female dynamics, in terms of healthy dating and mating, in terms of even reproducing the species, in terms of all of these things, you can see there's this weird, what's the right word I'm looking for? Oxymoron or irony?
Juxtaposition,
all the above. There's this strange thing that's happening in lots of these developed countries, not just in the West even, but lots of these more economically developed countries where by certain measures, things are statistically better than they've ever been at any other time in human history or close to it. But in terms of the way people actually feel and in terms of the way that you sense things, you can feel a decline. You can feel like there's like a moral decline, there's a cultural decline, there's a mental health decline, there's a physical health decline, there's something's not quite right. If you were to just look at the numbers, it would be like, okay, most of these numbers are good. You can point to some bad ones, but it's like there's something that is missing. There's a spirit which is dissipated.
Agreed. I used the term at the start, zoom out. And if we zoom out, we can see that society is, by statistics, in a largely better place. But as you say, there's something under the surface that doesn't feel quite right. And if we're speaking about men in particular, which is the majority of the audience that listen to this podcast, the biggest risk to them is themselves. Mm-hmm. And that is a terrible position to be in. And another term you used that stuck with me is you said vacuum. And if we lose some of those pillars or those four legs in the table, we have other things that step into the breach.
Yes.
And
yes, you don't there's no vacuum.
Yeah. One of the things that you've been outspoken on for a very long time and long before people even realized was in 2019, you were talking about men in women's sports.
Oh, yeah.
And you went viral for one of the first times with the breaking the women's deadlift record. And a lot of people back in 2019 when you did that didn't understand that it was as much of an issue, and it almost seemed like it was like an online silly thing. Yeah. But if we fast forward to 2024, we have a lot of sporting bodies who have now had to take action, and some who are still yet to, disappointingly enough, to actually deal with an issue of biological males competing against females. You were on that very early.
Yeah. I was on it much earlier than when I posted that, by the way. That's just the thing that went viral, right?
You were pushing back before then?
Yeah. I started really noticing it, I want to say, around 2015. Around 2015 was a particular breaking point. That was the Caitlyn Jenner year.
Of course.
That was like the mainstreaming of that particular issue across the West. Prior to that time, it was very fringe. It wasn't really like a mainstream talking point. it wasn't permeating the institutions in the way that it has been for the past 10 years or so now. So that was when I really started to, because do you know what? Do you know what the simple heuristic was for me on that? Actually, it's fascinating. Is when the person formerly known as Bruce Jenner, who's pretty famous, Olympic athlete, won multiple gold medals and so on. I think at the time was around 60 years old. So there's a person who's male, has been a man in the public eye for decades, on a big TV show, Keeping Up with Kardashians, whatever. And then this man comes out publicly and says he's a woman. And nobody, no big journalist, no magazine, no TV show, no big public figure asks the obvious question, what do you mean? Everyone just was like, okay, boom, celebrate, front cover of magazine, woman of the year, hasn't even been a woman for a year, but there was no like, oh, wait up. hang on. Oh, what are you even talking about? What exactly does that mean? How have you
It was just taken at face value.
It was just taken at face value. Whoop, switch up the pronouns. Everyone says, oh, you can't even say the word Bruce anymore. That's dead naming. This is just Caitlyn now. And I was like, huh? How is no one asking what is really obvious? If I came out tomorrow publicly and I just said, okay, guys, I am now a rooster. I'm a rooster. That's it. I would expect people to be like, huh? Like, what do you mean? Are you okay? What do you mean you're a rooster? Do you like... There's a lot of very obvious follow-up questions to that, and it didn't happen. This person won Woman of the Year. Are you saying this is a brave, stunning woman, whatever? And those obvious questions were not answered. And so the thing is, when we become so unmoored, and it's funny how all podcasts come back to this issue, I found. And I think the reason why it's important is because it's the most blatantly obvious and predominant example of where this all ultimately leads to. When people start talking about his truth and her truth and my truth and your truth. When I was a child, I never heard anyone say this is my truth or that's her truth.
It's a new term.
It's a new term. So the language has changed a lot in my relatively short lifetime. And I'm very aware, I'm very keen and perceptive of these societal changes.
As a rapper, you know the importance of words
language
and emotion. And we spoke in our last episode about during the C19 period how powerfully words were used to manipulate people's feelings and evoke fear in particular to increase adherence. Mm-hmm. But you're completely correct there. Where we have no grounding in what words mean or what terms relate to, we really start to lose track of ourselves.
Yes, because ultimately, when you knock all the pillars out of the table, metaphorically, what you end up left with eventually is everything becomes subjective, down to morality itself. Everything just becomes a matter of power, popularity, and opinion. So if I can convince a significant chunk of people, perhaps including experts, that 2 + 2 = 5, and you reach a stage where 60% of the population either believes that 2 + 2 = 5 or is willing to concede that it does. And maybe deep down they believe it equals 4, but they're not willing to go against that 60% majority. And so they're just kind of acquiescing to the idea that 2 + 2 = 5. Then that becomes the dominant mathematics. The truth is, no matter how many people believe that 2 + 2 = 5, doesn't make it true. But when these things just become subjective and then on top of that, the worst thing you can possibly do is disagree with someone, because then you're denying their reality or denying their right to exist,
or you're
being hateful, or
which is not something that people want to be called.
Of course
you
not.
don't want to be described as hateful. You want to be a nice guy, good guy. Well, I think good over nice in particular. Mm-hmm. But one of the terms that's been thrown around a lot online, and I'm sure you've been accused of it, I've been accused of it recently as well, is misinformation or disinformation.
Oh yeah.
How do you push back in a landscape that has censorship like that?
just tell the truth. Be courageous and tell the truth. Or don't. I don't want to be, man, Jordan Peterson nailed it on this one when he said, tell the truth or at least don't lie. I think the or at least don't lie is actually important because we're not always going to be absolutely correct with our statements and our assessments, right? But there's a difference between being wrong and lying.
And we've spoken today on having strong beliefs but loosely held to some extent, where new evidence comes up or new things are brought to the fore, and being willing to accept that something's come up that you hadn't considered. And that's one of the things that you're good at because, like you say, you kind of spitball ideas and you're thinking things out loud and you have some things that are convictions and you thoroughly believe in. But if somebody came to you with something else, you'd be like, interesting perspective. Like, let me explore that with you. And you're excited to talk about it. Hence why you do so many podcasts, your own and many guest appearances. And I find it funny when people throw up things like misinformation, disinformation, and use that term. It's to shut down the ability for people to speak out and maybe just probe a little bit, like, what do you mean by that? Or ask the follow-up question that wasn't asked that you were mentioning. Yeah,
and ask the follow-up question, okay, what is wrong with what they're saying? If someone is saying, hey, that person is spreading misinformation, again, the obvious follow-up question is, like, what specifically did they say that is wrong? And what do you believe is correct? Right? If there's someone out there who you believe is spreading misinformation or disinformation, what you should really want to do, particularly if they have a significant audience or they're influential, is you should want to communicate with them so that you can establish, okay, wait, this is where I think this thing is wrong, and here's why I think it's wrong, or here's an alternative perspective, whatever it is. And I do see a lot of signs that that this is starting to move in a better direction. I think I said on a podcast maybe about 2 to 3 years ago that I believe we've passed peak woke. And funnily enough, I've heard many people say that since then. I don't want to say I was the very first person to say it, but I think I was certainly. You
think post 2020 was peak woke?
Yeah, I think peak
2020 was insane.
I think peak woke was 2020. I think 2020 was the peak. I want to say summer 2020 or so, maybe BLM summer of love. That was kind of like the peak of just all of it. And then I think since then, the amount of people who are aware and who are willing to use their voice to speak up and say. When I first started speaking on certain things back in 2018, 2019, it was quite lonely. I wasn't the only one doing it, but it was a lot more lonely.
The term I would use is you put your head above the parapet.
Absolutely. And happy to do that. I've had
the
certain
broadest
things
shoulders carry the heaviest burden. And if you're capable of articulating yourself in the way that you are, it's very important you do that. It's
important you do it, man. To me, there's an ethical duty to do it. It's not a matter of, I have a lot of people tell me that I'm brave or I'm courageous or whatever, which I like in some ways.
Brave.
But in another way, I'm like, guys, I'm just saying things. I'm using my voice. I'm using my thumbs to post ideas. I'm not running into burning buildings or going off to fight in a foreign war or putting, my life at risk in that type of way. So there are many people out there, many millions of people out there who I consider far more brave than myself. But yeah, I think there's an ethical duty to do it, and you do have to pick your battles and fights because the world is messy, Lord knows, and you can't be fully aware and fully involved in every single thing that is going on in the world. There are some massive conflicts that are happening right now in the world, as have been throughout my entire lifetime. Some of them get more attention than other ones for whatever reason may be. And unless you're a full-time activist, it's going to be hard to be keeping up with all of these things 24/7 and speaking on absolutely everything. I think sometimes people also forget, like, I'm not a news reporter. My job is not to keep everybody informed about all the things happening across the globe and to have strong opinions on everything. I do what I can. And the things that I care about and I find most interesting and think I have most to lend my voice towards are not always going to be the same as what other people feel most passionately about and are more knowledgeable about and want to lend their voices towards. Like, we can't all fight every single battle all of the time. I just try to do what I can. We were talking earlier about locus of control and how we can really only control ourselves and then influence those in the sort of concentric circles around us. So I simply try to do that to the best of my ability in various areas, and hopefully by following me or listening to me in some way, shape, or form, I can nudge people.
You can be the rising tide.
Nudge people. Yeah, I can be part of it. You know, I'm not the tide itself. I can be a little drop in it. You can be a drop in it. And I think that what I do see, I do have a lot of optimism. I do love the fact that podcasts, for example, are rising, are growing in popularity. I do like the fact that they're eating into the traditional mainstream media.
They're independent media as well. Not to timestamp this podcast too much, but this week Trump was cut up in the mainstream media using the term bloodbath if he lost the election. But straight away, X and independent media completely exposed that to be taken out of context, and he wasn't indeed threatening some sort of
violent uprising.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that for me is something that's extremely important, because should that not have been the case with freedom of speech on X, or somebody to release a podcast or to create a video on YouTube and share it out there, albeit YouTube was very questionable during the C19 period. Yeah. That is really promising, because people then saw what was the truth, and straight away everyone calmed down, because it wasn't a potential presidential nominee threatening violence.
Exactly.
Because if that hadn't been the case, then we are in a situation where, oh my goodness, are we going to see civil war?
Yeah, the truth will set you free, and the truth always penetrates long term. In the long term, truth wins. There can be periods, and these periods can last for years, or occasionally even up to a decade, where the lies are beating out the truth. If you're telling the truth, you have no desire or need to censor the opposition or censor anyone who questions you. When people are super pro censorship, it should always be a red flag for people.
Have you seen the latest legislation in Scotland around the new hate legislation? It's been expanded out. You retweeted something yesterday that I saw, and it's related to this. But basically, the definition of hate has been extended out, where sharing particular jokes about quote unquote oppressed communities, or showing like a distasteful meme is now falling into that.
Oh, wow. This is in Scotland?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a particularly challenging government at the moment, the SNP, and it's a Green administration as well. Okay. And the Green Party, for anyone that's not paying attention, is very much a wolf in sheep's clothing when it comes to some of the policies they have. And that's been expanded out. And I'm worried what that means for content that you share that could be interpreted, and that's the key term, interpreted by somebody as offensive or hateful, and that's enough for you to potentially be charged or arrested or
well, that's already happened, hasn't it? I mean, what happened with Count Dankula all those years ago?
True.
I mean, he's Scottish.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
He got prosecuted for sharing a joke. That was back in what, 2018, 2019, I think?
That's a good point. There was a lady arrested as well for sharing a suffragettes ribbon.
Oh, okay.
Because it was deemed transphobic. Which is wild. When you consider what the suffragettes fought for, equality in terms of women having the vote, and that's being described as transphobic.
Transphobic's not a real word.
It's wild.
Yeah, man. Look, we have our countries have their issues, for sure. But the fact that sufficient numbers of people and sufficient numbers of influential people are aware of it and are speaking up and are drawing attention, to me, it's all good. It's all good. I know that we all sometimes wish that things would happen faster, or we as individuals or society as a whole wouldn't have to learn so many lessons the hardest ways possible. But I think that is just human nature. It's interesting. This year I've been, I say this year, more than this year, but from about midway through last year, I decided to read the Bible again from front to the end. I'm currently about halfway through the entire Bible. I'm currently in Psalms. But what's so fascinating about the first few books, when you're reading this story from thousands of years ago of the Israelites are, they're enslaved in Egypt, and then they're freed, and then they're wandering through the desert, and the cycles of it struck me more this time, just the cycles of faith, rebellion, faith, rebellion, faith, rebellion. Right. It just goes on and on and on. And I'm just like, human beings have always been this way. This is not new. What we're going through is not from a religious sense or just a historical sense. I'm like, this is not new. This is just what societies and nations and groups of people do. They go nuts.
It's like a market cycle.
Yes, it's like a market cycle. It's
like the crypto market. Yeah,
it really is. There's time periods where people just seem to. You can just look at the last 100 years. Look at the last 100 years. Go back to the 1920s, and then look up until where we are now with both world wars and with all the other things that happen. And you'll find periods where it seems like entire nations or entire blocks of nations lose their minds. They go nuts. They go crazy. Some ideology takes over and it brainwashes the masses, and they start doing this, and they start going, I would say, they're almost possessed by a demonic energy, and all the horrible stuff that results from that. And then it comes back to sensibility and norm. And then another ideology pops up. It could be similar to the old one. It could be something completely different. Millions of people are possessed by it, and it causes all these problems and conflicts, and then people fight against it.
I think we've
and
got
then
a few at the moment, though,
and,
Zuby, don't we? Because I think under the woke umbrella, you've got the trans issue, you've got climate alarmism, you've maybe got another couple of things that, yeah, that's true.
Gender war.
Yeah, exactly. So these things are almost under one umbrella. And last time I was in Dubai, I interviewed Daniel Priestley, and one of the things I try and do as a podcaster is not always ask the same questions. Sure. I've asked you a few different questions that you maybe not been asked before, or variations of. And I was asking Daniel about some of his tweets, and one of his tweets was phrases to live by: the pendulum always swings back.
Yes.
And we actually ended up talking, of course, about the woke ideology. And he was saying, yeah, the pendulum will swing back.
Of course.
And if you feel that we're past peak woke, where do you think we are on the pendulum swing?
I think that we are on the early stage of it coming back towards the center.
Yeah.
I think we do also have to be cautious, and this might not be something that people feel yet, but you also have to be careful of it not overswinging the opposite way.
And being regressive.
Yes.
So I would say that I'm not in favor of progressive politics, but I'm not in favor of regressive politics either.
You don't want it to be super right-wing reactionary either.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? So we've seen, for lack of a better term, we've seen the progressive left go too far and
lose
have
their minds,
their excesses, really. And we don't want their reactionary right to go too far in the opposite direction as things correct. Probably some elements will, because human beings suck at balance and equilibrium, certainly on a societal level. But I think the more we can just raise people's consciousness and just have people, I think awareness is very powerful in itself. Just having people thinking about some of these ideas and being aware of it for themselves. I think if you are aware of your own proclivities and you are aware, the scariest people are those who aren't even like aware of their own.
A term I use in the podcast all the time is living on autopilot.
Yeah.
Really easy to do now. Mm-hmm. Screens, devices, fast food, porn, recreational drugs, all these things that we have really easy access to and can lean into.
Yes.
We can just coast through on autopilot without even being aware of our surroundings and live in a way that's totally out of alignment with traditional values and things that make us feel good.
You've said something that's so interesting. Because we've talked a lot about society and culture, and there could be a question asked, what's meant when we say society or when we say culture? Loops back to what we were saying at the beginning about multiculturalism. I think that the healthier a culture is overall, and the healthier the environment is, the more okay and the safer it is to be on autopilot. Because the autopilot and the average is decent. There can be a time and a place where the average person is physically healthy, mentally healthy, they have purpose, they have meaning, they have a family, they have children, they're normal, they don't have vices and so on. And that's the default. That's the norm. You can also find societies, not so far away, where the average is mentally unhealthy, physically unhealthy, coming from or creating some type of broken family, some type of substance abuse issue, right? And that's the norm, right? All of these things. So the more debased, unmoored, toxic the society is, this is everything from the food to the entertainment to everything else, the more you need to consciously be the exception. The more you have to think about this and be like, okay, I'm not going to do the norm. I'm not going to be on autopilot. And then hopefully we can create a society again where it's somewhat safe to be on autopilot because the average level of consciousness and morality and standards and ethics and behaviors are so high that the average is much elevated compared to where it is now. So I think that's simply where we are. I think we now live in a time and in an age, whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, if you truly want to be healthy, happy, and successful in various departments, Average ain't good enough. It's not good enough to be the average man. I've said before on a podcast and it went super viral. The average man cannot do a pull-up. The average man cannot do 10 push-ups. The average man is in debt.
Has less than £1,000 in the bank account.
Exactly. The average man, average is not good enough. Again, I'm not saying this to be mean. I'm saying this to be real. You don't want to be aiming for average. Maybe there was a time, maybe 60 or 70 years ago, average was good enough. At this time, average has declined so much that it's just not. So if you want to succeed, and I would say this further, if you want to raise healthy children and have a good family and overall improve your nation, we've all got to be striving above the average. You can look around and go, you know what? If you're looking around and you're seeing all this and you're like, man, I don't like the way this is heading. I'm not happy with where my society, my nation, all of these things are. I would recommend people take a look at themselves. None of us are perfect. We all fall far from God's grace. But look at ourselves and think, okay, these are the things. Be honest with yourself. Be radically honest and say, you know what? These are the things that I'm failing with. Like it could be your nutrition. It could be you doing something that you know you shouldn't be doing. We all have those things. It could be you should be exercising, but you're not doing it. You've got a temper and you haven't managed it. Like you're not. You should call and reconcile with your father or your mother or your brother or sister, and you're just not doing whatever those things are for the individual. I would encourage people.
It's an empowering message. Take action on those things, and we can move the dial in the right direction.
Yes, and I think people would be surprised by, you'll know this as well as I do, something as simple as getting to a healthy body weight, exercising regularly, eating good foods. You'll be surprised how much of a knock-on impact that will have on these other areas.
It's the pebble at the top of the avalanche. It's the gateway drug to self-development. I really feel that way.
Absolutely.
One of the only things I'm left to ask you, Zuby, is I saw you share some research around the amount of screen time that people were taking out of their life and out of their day. And you mentioned at the end of the tweet that it was in relation to a new book that you're working on. Your first book was on health and fitness.
Yes.
What are you working on this time around?
Yeah, sure. So my first book was Strong Advice, Zuby's Guide to Fitness for Everybody. Helped a lot of people get in shape, which I'm very happy about. Second book was a children's book called The Candy Calamity, which was actually also about self-control, exercise, nutrition. The third book I'm working on my working title is Uncommon Sense, Winning in the Age of Victimhood and Emotional Incontinence. So I haven't spoken much about the book yet on podcasts, but I'll give people the synopsis. Back in 2022, I had a viral thread. I think I wrote it around my 36th birthday, and it was 36 things I would tell my 20-year-old self. So really it was advice for younger people, in particular, whether they're teens or in their early 20s. And it was a 36-point thread, and it covered various things from attitudes and approaches towards life, family, money, career, health, how you treat other people. It didn't take me that long to write. I just wrote it, and I ended up getting, I think, 15 to 20 million impressions. Like, it got shared all around the world. People really, really liked and loved it. So with this book, I've taken each of those points and turned it into a chapter. So instead of just being a single sentence, I've taken each of those and, okay, let's go into this idea. Let's flesh it out. And I'm just sharing things that I found helpful. These are not all. There's no new ideas under the sun. These are not like brand new ideas. These are things I want to call it uncommon sense, because a lot of them are principles and ideas that I think that people should know.
Let's get back to.
Yeah, or a lot of people, somewhere in them, they already know it. I've heard people say that you pretty much know all the life lessons you need by the age of like 5 or 6, at least as a basic principle. Treat other people like you want to be treated. Don't take people's stuff. Don't hit people. Like you learn the basics pretty early. So it's just reiterating those and then fleshing it out and just sharing from my perspective, my experiences in a way that other people can just learn from, and it can help them and just give them a better, more optimistic way to navigate the world. That's all I'm trying to do. I want to help people with it, just like I wanted to help people with my previous books. But it's fun and it's entertaining.
I'm really excited to see that when it comes to fruition, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about it. For those that aren't already connected with you, where should they head towards?
No doubt. You can find me on all social media at Zuby Music. That is ZUBY Music, or ZUBY Music for my American friends. And you can, I'll lead people to my podcast since I'm on a podcast. I have one it's called Real Talk with Zuby. It's been running for about 5 years at this point in time. Had some big guests on, Elon Musk, Alex Hormozy, a lot of cool people. And yeah, you can find that on all the usual podcast platforms, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen.
Brilliant, Zuby. Thank you so much. And thank you to the listener. I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.